Super excited for our webinar today on empowering remote teamwork without micromanagement. It's something that Jevin and I are really both passionate about and have worked on in different ways. I can give you a little bit of my background and then would love to have Jevin introduce himself a little bit as well. I'm the co-founder of Range. We're a team success platform. We help teams, particularly remote and distributed teams, communicate day to day about their work and create alignment and build culture and things like that over time. Happy to kind of answer more questions about that, but my kind of lens on remote is through a lot of the teams that we work with. So we work with a bunch of tech and other types of companies who are distributed, and kind of in a prior life, I was a organizational development consultant, and so I worked with tech companies on how they operate, and so bring a lot of that excitement, and I'm currently calling in from home, so working distributed today as well. Jevin, would love to have you introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Yeah, you're living the real remote life. Yeah, my name is Jevin Malte. I'm here in Ottawa, Canada. I am a software engineer. It's my background. I've been doing that for like a decade and a half or so professionally. And then about 10 years ago, I left on my own from working in the federal government here in Canada and started my own software consultancy. And that kind of grew to hiring, consultants and employees really all over the world. So I've got a decade of experience, probably hired and managed over 50 people from my house over those years. So, ranging from all kinds of different, experience, virtual assistants to architects to software engineers, developers, designers, all of this. So I've been on the receiving end of micromanagement. And on the giving end, I'm a recovering micromanager. So got insights on both sides for sure.
Yeah, I like that. I think we've all been a micromanager, whether we meant to or not.
Sure.
Even if it's just with a spouse or a friend. So it's something we can all resonate with, which is part of why I was really excited about this topic. One of the things there is that micromanagement is pretty natural. Just in the needs that come up, I think is we all are kind of afraid sometimes about kind of work that's happening or kind of things that are really important to us, whether that's a home renovation or a project that you're working on for a big client. And so a lot of the reasons that people start to micromanage is mostly a desire to be successful. Like we want projects to go well. And sometimes what that means is we default to trying to control everything that happens. And when that's on, when you're working on a team, that can actually feel really disempowering for folks. And so one of the different factors that we've seen are things like if you don't have enough information about the work, you really kind of default into that control aspect. If you don't have enough trust with your teammates, like you don't know them very well, or they just seem kind of like random folks, then that can also start to kind of lead into micromanagement. I'm curious, Jevin, when you've seen kind of micromanagement crop up for you, what you felt like were some of those reasons?
Yeah, so on the receiving side for me, I felt when I was being micromanaged, it was, I think in large part, they didn't trust me for one. I think where there's like, I don't really believe that Jevin's actually able to get things done, especially in the way that they would want. And so they really felt they needed to have a hand in that. And this was actually a huge issue, probably the biggest issue why the last startup I was at didn't work out. So that was one, I think, trust. The other was they just felt like they could do a better job than everyone on the team. And so they were involved.
That's a good feeling.
Right? Like, hey, okay, you're the CEO of the company and you want to do everyone's job, or you're really not happy with how things are done. And so just take away all the autonomy and just do the work, or tell people very specifically how to work. So those are the two top things that I've seen, at least people micromanaging me. And then me micromanaging people, I've found was when I would get some sort of signal or interpret a signal that the person was not actually fully committed, like actually doing the work. And I thought maybe they're like not at their desk, or like maybe they're just slacking off and they actually aren't giving me their best effort. And so I would immediately just like recoil and like, okay, I need hourly updates, tell me every hour what you're doing. Ridiculous, right? And so that was That's kind of on both sides how
Yeah,
I've
it sounds like that
experienced
kind
it.
of uncertainty, whether it's trust-based or information-based, really
Hmm.
leads to this urge to micromanage. I'm curious, folks who are uh, watching and listening, please feel free to add in the chat like reasons you felt the urge to micromanage, as mixed and varied as those may be. Curious to kind of hear your own experiences with that as well. Um, One of the things that we've observed at Range is that as teams are distributed, a lot of that uncertainty or lack of trust or information is really highlighted, because you may not have ever met someone face to face, or you may not know whether they have started work yet or not. And as we see trends in how companies are becoming even more distributed, and I think some folks wrote in about leading entirely remote teams now, it's really started to kind of highlight this micromanagement desire. And I think for the teams that we work with, what we see is it feels pretty crappy. Sorry for poor word choice, but it's a pretty disempowering experience to not be trusted, I think, as you were saying, Devin. And um, what it means is that we lose out on a lot of the creativity and the excitement for those people actually doing the work. And so I think it actually results in poorer work quality when one or two people try to control the entire process, because as we said, we're never the best at everything. Even when I think like, no, I'm distinctly better at this,
Mm.
then when I have like a conversation with someone on my team, if I'm proactive and reaching out to try not to micromanage, I always learn something. And we actually get to a much better solution because it was collaborative and empowering than it was uh, when I just tried to do it myself, essentially, or tried to manage the process so much. Um, yeah, I see Tristan wrote in saying that when he's given a task to someone remote and then realized like it wasn't communicated properly, and then you have to kind of go in circles
Yeah.
with that process. And I think remote makes that, or distributed makes that even harder because you don't necessarily see someone going off track.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm curious any experiences you've had remote versus in person, why it's different with micromanagement.
Yeah, I think partly because the feedback loop can be a lot longer. So
Yeah.
um, I had, so if you are, just trying to think of an example. Okay, so this past weekend, you might notice that up here above my sunroom, above my fireplace, there's no picture. Okay, so my wife has ideas and plans for it. She's always thinking, but nothing's happening. So I really want to put something on there that's, this place is beautiful. It's very much her style. Um,
Yeah.
and so I went on Fiverr and I commissioned someone to make me a watercolor paint of a bowl of pho, right? So like Vietnamese
Okay.
soup. Um, but what I realized is the first iteration that came back, like I did not give very good expectations or instructions on how to do that. After I realized, first iteration was pretty terrible, at least not for my vision. I had to really lay out the expectations and like the vision really well. And then the next iteration came back really, really good. So I think, yeah, Tristan brings up a great point, which reminds me, right? Like when you set those expectations kind of both ways, where, the person's saying, hey, I'm going to get back to you at this time with this particular deliverable. And me as the manager, like I either agree to that or I can iterate to say, I'd rather if you gave me an update by the end of the day or give me this other maybe milestone deliverable. So especially when you don't really
Yeah.
trust them, starting this new relationship of trust and seeing how you guys work together, then I think that's helpful. But that's a story just from recently.
It's a great example of just like a very key thing. Um, One of the things we kind of alluded to briefly is like
Mm-hmm.
why micromanagement is a problem.
Yeah,
I'm curious for anyone who's kind of watching, have you ever enjoyed being a micromanager?
it's a
We
great
talk
question.
about a lot about the impact on employees or teammates, but I think it's pretty unenjoyable and not a great use of kind of leaders' time as well to be micromanaging and to be following along. The reason that you've chosen to work with someone on Fiverr is because they know how to paint, or they know how to do whatever it is their role is much better than you. And so for thinking about how you optimize a team's functioning, you want everyone to be allocated towards kind of their best work, and micromanagement, it really isn't anyone's. But I'm curious about some of the kind of disempowerment or other things that you've seen, Jevin, where when you see micromanagement get to an extent, either you yourself experiencing it or other kind of you actually leading the micromanagement, what happens on the team when that's going on?
Yes, great. But I will say too, at the end, like during the Q&A time, if you have a good story of being micromanaged, or good story, interesting story, crazy story, we want to pull you in. We want you to share that with
Yeah.
us. So for me, yeah, I mean, what happens that I've seen, I was just, why is it a problem? I was just kind of brainstorming for this presentation. What are some things that I've seen? One is it really just reduces the freedom of someone's like higher level thinking and problem solving. And so imagine you are you're a PhD data scientist. I'm just taking an example in my previous company. And someone says like, no, this is the exact algorithm and math that you need to go and do to do it.
Yeah.
Like that's pretty offensive if someone's is telling you and they're they don't have the same context or education or experience, versus like you are very like you've been doing this for 10 years, you are an expert in this really high level cognitive problem solving thing. So imagine
Yeah.
like in that situation, right? You're just they're taking all of that extra effort, and so it's very demotivating, I think, or
Yeah.
disempowering. And the other thing, I mean, even on the managerial side, like you're just, if you are a CEO or even just a manager, like your job is to work by definition more strategically than those who are kind of below you. You're supposed to be
Yeah.
helping to make direction, making sure everyone's kind of on the same path. And so if you're starting to really dive down deep into everyone else's stuff, then you're taking away from the higher level strategic stuff that by definition you should be working on. So,
Yeah.
so you're really diluting the effort and kind of stealing away from the company, assuming you have employees that are actually capable. And then
Yeah.
third is, you just have kind of people frustrated on both sides. I think managers are frustrated that they have to jump in or feel they have to jump in. And then you
Yeah.
have the employees that are just like, why is the manager jumping in to do this? I can do this stuff myself. So we've got some ideas coming up on how we can maybe work through that. But anyways, Jen, back to you if you have any further ideas on why you think it's a problem.
No, I think I think it's something that like a lot of leaders are concerned about. Like they're worried about being a micromanager. And like we want the teams that we work with to feel empowered and to meet our goals. And so I think one of the things that we all felt when preparing for this webinar is that it's a really natural thing. And so how do we help people come up with these strategies, and kind of help you understand what goes into micromanagement, and so then how you actually kind of combat it. And so that's what we kind of want to talk through next, is some of the different ways in which you can break down an understanding of micromanagement, and therefore the solutions that you can then build to address it. Because it's not like there's a anti-micromanagement tool, though range is helpful on that front. But
So you've got the
we think
brand
about
is
it kind of by breaking it down. And oops, I skipped a slide, apologies. But what we want to talk about is how you actually solve for micromanagement. And so one of the kind of first areas that we wanted to dive into that we kind of alluded to was around trust and how that relates to micromanagement. I think actually the first example that Jevin shared was that his leader really just didn't trust him as kind of executing on the work. And so some of the tips that we get into here are really about how you actually can establish that trust relationship, especially if you've actually never met someone in person, you're hiring them kind of remote, or your team even moved apart, how you actually build that over time. And a lot of it relates to kind of addressing those things that then lead to micromanagement. I know the one that kind of Jevin was excited to kind of touch on was creating a habit. So maybe we can start there and we can dive into some of the other ideas as well.
So you say creating a habit? Is that what you said?
Yes, that's what I had written down. I'm also happy to
I
start
mean,
with that
sure.
if that's easier.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Kind of the
Creating a habit
idea
of
of
building
making a,
relationships. For sure. Okay. So, one example that comes to mind is I have a developer in Poland, consultant guy who I've been working with for over 6 years now, 6 or 7 years, where
yeah,
initially, like, I really didn't know the guy. I didn't know how good he was. And so we would do what we call pair programming, where so he would be over there, I'd be here, and we would just kind of hack away on the same screen virtually together. And so over like time and years, like I would say like, okay, we don't need to pair. Like you're obviously very competent. In fact, probably more like for sure more confident than I am as a developer. Um, and then I would just give him like just tasks like, hey, could you just get this done? And then like he would get done the next day. And then I would look at his code and be like, perfect. And then we got to a place where I would have entire projects. I would just I'd do the designs. I would give them all the features that I needed, broken down with a decent amount of detail. I'd let them go. And a month later, like it was all done. And I would have very, very little need for interaction. So, it does
That's the
take
dream
time to
relationship.
be able to develop this. What's that?
I just said that's the dream working relationship.
Yeah, well, that's it. But it does take time and this effort. Um, so a couple of ideas. One is this thing called Donut. So if this is Donut is a fun little tool. I think they're in New York City.
Mhm.
But you add this to Slack, I think Microsoft Teams too, and it creates a channel called like Coffee Dates or whatever you want to call it. And if you join up into that channel every weekly or bi-weekly, you get matched up with someone else in the company who you likely don't talk too much. They've got a little algorithm to try to match you up. And so that way you can start developing relationships with people wouldn't normally have a relationship, learning about them. And it's a way you can build a habit. You can set it up maybe if you're on a dev team or whatever, you can have these kind of coffee dates built up as a habit. And Jen, tell us a little bit about like how Range could do that if you incorporate it on your team.
Yeah. So a lot of the thinking behind range is about how you kind of repeatedly build this relationship over time, especially as you're maybe just getting to know someone. And so in range, you share a daily update with your team about what you're working on each day, but you also answer a team building question. And we start them out really lightweight, like, what was your favorite class that you took in university or something of that nature. And we kind of build up some of the vulnerability over time. And what that allows is that when you're talking about work, you're also talking about kind of each other as people. One of the easy things that's easy to default into when you're in a remote working relationship is that every meeting is focused just on work, that it's a project update, and you kind of really quickly dive into that. Because the like awkward chit chat is a little bit harder over video. And so one of the things that we found is that having these like icebreaker type questions included in our product really helped people to repeatedly kind of connect with one another. So even outside of range, we have these list of team building questions on our website at icebreaker.range.co. And that allows you to actually answer team building questions, even if you're just having a team sync with people over video. And so especially for I think the person who wrote in about kind of their new team that's going to be entirely distributed, that's a really good way to establish that habit on a recurring basis so that you are building that relationship that Devin managed to build with like this person. And sometimes you need hacks to kind of help you get started. And like pair programming is a good way, or working really closely. And then you're able to work kind of further apart as well. The kind of next topic we had was around investing in kind of dependability. And it's interesting with remote or distributed things, your brain just kind of jumps to the uncertainty of things. And so if you don't know what someone is working on or don't have access to information, you start to make assumptions because we're all human. and that's how we think about things. But one of the operations or practices that can support this is having clear times where you might check in, or clear expectations, and making sure that your team is actually understanding kind of the reason for that it's creating that sense of dependability. So with range, we check in daily. And so we each know kind of what each other is up to. So even if someone is working from home, like myself, they know what I'm up to today. And so for instance, I put my top item for today as webinar. So they have a sense for what I'm doing this morning and that I might be occupied during this time, so might not be as responsive. Other ways to do that are creating kind of clear project check-ins or deadlines. I'm curious, Jevin, when you've worked with the teams, how you've created that sense of dependability on both sides.
Yeah, so with the current organization I'm with, we use Clubhouse, which is kind of just a project management tool. And whenever I'm like starting to work on a task, I just move it to started. and when it's done, it's done. And what you can do is on the status, there's like a status page, and you can just see like what everyone's put into their status and like when they put it there. So it's kind of fun. Like you can just log in every day and be like, okay, that person's working on this thing that I need, great, or they haven't,
Yeah.
or whatever. And so it gives a bit more transparency to what's happening, and confidence that like other people are doing things too. Not that I'm super worried about that, but that I don't know, that things are, yeah, but like maybe it is actually, yeah.
Yeah, I I do think that project tracker is particularly helpful for teams that are distributed, whether it's Asana or Clubhouse or
Mhm.
Jira, depending on your type of team.
Yeah,
But knowing that someone has like grabbed that issue, if it's in Jira, or that bug, and is working on it, is really helpful to have the system that's actually communicating that. So you don't always have to communicate in a point-to-point fashion of like, hey, I've got it with a Slack
yeah,
message. Slack's really good for like urgent communication, but it's not super helpful for like context being shared. And so that's where those project trackers I think are really useful. And
yeah,
you can use that in conversations of like, hey, I thought we had agreed that this was the timeline, and making really clear kind of what expectations are. A lot of it is about clarifying those over time, and we find that writing them down is helpful, which we'll get into a little bit more later as well.
yeah.
um,
I think, I mean,
Go
one
ahead.
thing I just want to highlight too is, having these, project management tools, or like these kind of enforced check-ins, like they're not, it can be coming, hopefully it's coming from a place that's not malicious, right? It's like, it's not that we don't trust you, it's that this is actually really helpful for the rest of the team to know, things that they're
Yeah.
depending on you for, right? Just to know where it's at, so that people don't have to hound each other. Like we know you're autonomous, but we still have dependencies on one another, and some expectations. Um, so I think
Yeah,
it's important to highlight it.
it could be nice to have a doc that's like, here's like our team's practices or like operations. So it
Yeah.
also is clear that it's not about a specific person. I've been starting to think more and more about team training. Like you have a team onboarding, like here's how our team
Nice.
works. I think that's really helpful, especially as you're starting a new team or you're trying to launch a project, to just kind of help create the expectations and understanding of like why it's helpful to the rest of the team.
Yep.
I know, Devin, you were telling me about some of your employee-led one-on-ones and how you use that to build trust. I'd love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, as a manager, I've found this to be one of the most potent tools in my tool belt to start developing trust in both directions. So everyone's probably had experience with one-on-ones, but it's a very loaded kind of term. So I just wanted to further like describe it as these are employee-led one-on-ones. So this is a manager who sits down with the employee, ideally weekly for minimum 1 hour, to just talk about what they want to talk about. They could be saying, oh, probably if you start doing these, for the first 10 weeks, people are not going to be like, oh, I'm really struggling here at the company. Like I'm thinking about leaving. This is not how they're initially going to start, right? Because maybe that trust is not being established. But imagine talking for 10 weeks about, hey, like, where do you want to go in your career? Like, hey, tell us what the favorite things that you like doing in the company, or, what's your life situation like, and what can we do to support that? After doing this for many weeks, like it's going to fast track that trust, just because you've spent
Yeah.
10 hours with this person and you've talked about those like further, more deeper, more vulnerable questions, right? That you've probably got from the icebreakers.range.co website. And, so I've found that to be really powerful. It's a huge investment. You can imagine if you're a manager of 3 people, that's 3 hours. You're going to be exhausted after those. But
Yeah.
I mean, if this is what you want to do, is develop trust and be able to not micromanage people, um, it's a really powerful technique.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. What's been interesting, with some of our teammates that are more distributed is that different people like to have those one-on-ones in different ways. So some people really like the video connection. It like helps communicate so much more emotion and things like that when you can see someone's face. And then other teammates really prefer the phone and to be like walking while they're on their one-on-one and like getting that movement in. So that's one thing you can also use, is to like learn how someone actually, what helps them open up,
Yes.
because it may not be the natural default. It's also, I think, different across different cultures. So when you're working internationally, like some teams will feel more comfortable based on their local culture talking about personal items. And so getting a sense for what that is, if you're working with someone who's from a different background than yourself, I think can be useful. We have our team questions, as I've mentioned, and we find that they land differently in different cultures. Like some people are like, oh, why are you asking me about myself? This is work. And so that's a good thing to like understand and kind of cater your own approach to, that it may not be kind of holistic if you're working with people across the globe.
That's great.
Um, the Oh, did you have more to add there? Otherwise, we can
No,
move on
I
to
was gonna say
the next topic.
let's check out the
Sweet.
next thing.
Yeah. Um, the next one really relates to information sharing, which obviously we're on a remote webinar, so we care deeply about. But one of the things there that comes up is this access to information. We find that a lot of the companies that we work with struggle when they're going from all in person to a distributed teammate or remote, because they're so used to sharing things just by the moment or kind of walking past each other in in-person meetings. So I'm excited to hear about some of the asynchronous solutions, Jevin, that you've experienced with messaging and video, and kind of how you've made that work with your teams.
Yeah. So one of the biggest challenges I've found with information sharing on remote teams, especially hybrid teams, where there's defined as some people work together like physically in person and others work remotely.
Yeah.
And so there's a disconnect in terms of what's fair in terms of communication. So a good example would be like water cooler conversations. So the two people who are in the office together, they're at the water cooler and they say, hey, hey Bob, I'm working on this project. How's it going? And then, hey Alice, yeah, it's going really well. Let's think about doing this one major decision point thing. And they're like, that sounds great. Let's go talk about it. And then the two of them just hash it out for half an hour. Something important happens,
Yeah.
and then Joe is working in Thailand, and totally misses out on this important information where they could have had some really good input to that. And so trying to be able to have, John's gonna talk more specifically about being liberal with what you're sharing. But what I found is taking some of this and putting it into some sort of medium where other people can see it in their own time.
Yeah.
So, hey, we had this conversation, let's record it, and we can put it into Slack, or we can do a quick screen share of like our little whiteboard thing that we were doing, and post it so that other people can see it in their own time, and they're not, even if they're sleeping, when they're on the other side of the world.
Yeah, I definitely like someone's asleep and you need access, you need the information that's in their brain is really not a great feeling. So one of the things that we found is being pretty rigorous about how you document processes and decisions and information. So that can range from things like the project management stuff that we were talking about earlier to like how you run a meeting, so that people kind of understand that ethos and flow, all the way to kind of meeting notes from each time and kind of decisions that come out of it, so that if I'm not able to attend a meeting because of time zone, or maybe just because of my work stream, that I still can learn from what was decided or be kept in the loop. And so, having shared documents in Google Drive, being able to share information on Slack, like that's super important for people who are working asynchronously. One of the things, I was actually at a dinner last night with some folks who kind of work in a similar space, and it's kind of Slack can become very noisy. So one of the things that people end up doing is actually like muting all notifications, or having one way where you can get an urgent communication, but not expecting someone to be responsive immediately on Slack. I think that's one of the key things when you're empowering people to work distributed, is note that it may be 10 to 15 minutes before they respond because they're in the middle of work, versus expecting Slack to be the same thing as walking up to someone and tapping them on the shoulder. It can be different. And if you want people to be in flow, you want to establish those types of boundaries. With kind of documentation, I think the point Jevin was starting on earlier around being liberal, we found on our team it's really helpful to kind of push the edge on what we're comfortable sharing from leaders to the rest of the team. And I think from leaders from everyone on the team to everyone else, of sharing things that are work in progress, sharing information or decisions that have been made, like being really open about what's going on. Because even if you're sharing an update with the team every day, if the update every day is I'm working on X and X doesn't change, then people don't really know what that means.
Right.
And so kind of setting those expectations of like, sharing your document so that people can kind of dive in and see what you're up to. And that comes from both sides, about a leader or about the team. Like if a leader never shares their documents that are in progress, like your team's not going to do it either. There's a lot of role modeling that goes on there. Yeah, I'm curious how you found sharing information kind of with Loom or Twist or other things. What other tools have come up for you, Jevin?
Yeah, so I really like to use Loom for all kinds of different contexts. I used to do these in the last company. What I used to do was these not all hands meetings. So I would just make like a weekly or bi-weekly little presentation of some like just ideas of like, hey, or some like decisions like, hey, here's where we're going. And I would just post that like it's a 10-minute presentation and just put it in Slack.
Yeah.
And then I had consequently this guy from Poland who I hired and was working with me. He's like, man, this is amazing. Like the last company he was with, I think was in San Francisco. So it was like an extra 3 hours. So it was like 9 hours difference.
Yeah.
And he'd have to stay up for these all hand meetings. And it was happening like midnight for him. Where it's like, hey, he could just like watch it the next morning for literally no downside for the company, right? It's not like he was contributing much as far as feedback in these all hands meetings. Anyways, it's just this is like a live thing we do. So I found that pretty helpful with Loom and with Slack. I'm not a huge everything in Slack type of person. I don't like having like all these bolded channels show up and like feel the need that I need to go and scroll through and like try to pull out any snippets that might be important for my work. Instead, I try to push everything into the project management thing and only tag the people that are appropriate. But someone might say, hey, like, do you know about this? I'm like, no. And then they'll send me in, pull me in. And it's like, oh, I have the whole context nicely organized by task and I can review it in my own time. So I found that to be really powerful to take the stress off. The anxiety of like the knock Slack stuff.
Yeah, I found especially with teams that are mixed, where some people are in an office together and some people are distributed, it can be really helpful to also take some of those water cooler conversations and put them into Slack. So like if someone's like grabs me and says like, hey, like quick question on this, or like, what did you think of that interview candidate? We'll try to then follow up on Slack and be like, hey, this got discussed in person, like FYI, or wherever the proper tool is. Like we obviously used Range a lot, but I think the thing that can help shift there is when you're thinking about your current communication or how you're used to communicating on a team that's in person, being like, okay, what might be missing if then I were not in the same location as someone, and using that to think about what processes or what systems you might need in place to help facilitate that on the trust building or information kind of sharing side as well. The kind of next topic that we had was around shared expectations, which we kind of alluded to a little bit earlier. And I'll kind of start off here a little bit and then have you, Devin, kind of fill in. But one of the key things I think for trust building and for understanding kind of any relationship with someone is like, are we on the same page? And so what we see cause a lot of conflict is when you think something is supposed to be done by end of day and someone else thinks end of day means midnight their time, which is actually tomorrow for you. Or something like your expectation of what completion looks like on a project is not what someone else's understanding is. Or when you say work distributed, that's great, and someone says like, okay, cool, I can work from whatever time I need, but you actually thought they were going to be online at certain times, like a lot of that causes conflict, and it ends up feeling personal where you're upset with someone, you're like, ugh, how can they do that? When really it's about like, you didn't have the right expectations for and kind of weren't in sync there for what that would actually look like. So as we've kind of talked about, one of the main things that we think about at Range is putting a system in place or a kind of set of rules that are documented for how you expect people to kind of operate. And so we use Range to kind of check in with each other on a daily basis. And that's kind of a set guideline for the team, is that we expect that everyone is doing that. Now, when we actually wrote up our personal set of guidelines for how we work distributed, one of our key principles was actually empathy even over process. So one thing is, when you're establishing process and rules, you can easily become a micromanager.
Mm,
And so part of the understanding there is that you don't want to solve for every single edge case. It's kind of putting in like guardrails for people and helping them understand why that's important and why it's useful on both sides. We had a teammate share that they hadn't thought about empathy through the lens of being empathetic for the team when they're working distributed or when they're changing their schedule.
mm,
They thought about people being empathetic for them, that they have to deal with a personal issue or they need to change their schedule. But the idea that that impacts the team, they hadn't really processed that. And so that was a really useful discussion for us when we were thinking through like establishing rules. Is like, cool, let's think about these as guides, and there's always empathy and understanding with what's going on. But you don't want to set a shared expectations and get so granular that you end up back in the place where you are micromanaging work. Which I think there's also that risk on kind of the deliverables and timing. So I'm curious, Jevin, how you think about doing that kind of with empathy and doing that well for teams.
yeah. So I guess I used to, in general, like I am a pretty good delegator in that I do not want to do everything myself. It's like not the opposite. Like I want to find good people and like let them do it. But I've taken that to
Yeah.
the extreme where I've given them a lot of liberty and they weren't either ready for it or whatever, or we did not have those
Right.
shared expectations and I was disappointed. They were disappointed. Did not work out. Right. So, so the way I approach it now is like that's a really painful example is that things kind of fell apart. So instead, I'd rather maybe take a little bit of awkwardness and maybe a bit of confrontation at the beginning, and come up with ways where we can both kind of agree on what it is that needs to happen, right? So I
Yeah.
think a lot of us, or at least I initially, shied away from like, oh, can we talk about deadlines? Like, like I don't know, and it was
Yeah.
really awkward to do. Where now it's like it's not that awkward. It's like, hey, both of us want to be secure in this task or this project, about what it is, when people need it, and so like they have freedom now, right? It's like they can actually
Yeah.
maybe take longer than they expected, and they can do these other things that are hard priority, so yeah, so some questions that I like, some ways of framing it that I like is, when do you think you could get that, that thing done? Like, when can I expect it, do you think? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
And you could say it like that or something, and it's like and all of a sudden it becomes a conversation, right? It's not just like,
Yeah.
oh, Friday, like, and so it's a conversation and negotiation, which I think is perfectly reasonable. And maybe you're not ready to do that. Maybe you can say, like, maybe that's too much of a risk where it's, it's a bigger project, it's 1 month, it's 2 weeks. You could say, hey, is it all right if we cut it up into 2 different milestones and we check in about it
Yeah.
halfway through? And that way, so you're trying to find ways that you can, at the comfort level at which you trust them, right? This is from the managerial side, where if you only
Yeah.
trust them X amount to do things, it's like, we'll come up with a milestone or a check-in at that level. It could be that you don't trust them at all. It's like, all right, let's work on this together, and then start from there, for example.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so that's kind of my growth experience, at least when I'm delegating to other people.
Yeah. I really liked your point around someone may not be ready for it yet.
Mm,
I think there's a good learning process when you're first working with someone about, I don't really like describing it as level of seniority, but kind of a little bit their ability to go off and be autonomous. And I think one of the key abilities in that is knowing when you're stuck and raising a flag. So when someone who kind of from the lens of someone who's being managed or being led, um, it can feel really daunting of like, I'm supposed to be at this X milestone by Friday. I'm so confused, or like I don't know where to get started. And that can be harder to kind of raise a flag on, especially when you're remote, because if you don't see the person being confused, it's a little bit harder.
mm,
And so establishing those check-in points and kind of that learning process, I often do it by saying like, hey, do you want to collaborate on that? Like, do you want to spend an hour, half hour, just like jamming on it? Like, what's useful
yes.
to you? And that kind of helps it feel a little bit more like I'm on the team rather than trying to push it. Another one of the points I think you navigated really clearly is trying to not be a micromanager doesn't mean you shouldn't manage. I think people fall into kind of two dualities, myself included, of either being extremely on the control side or just like laissez-faire, like do whatever you want, like I'm just here if you need me. And that can actually be really hard for a teammate to work with. And it may feel really exciting for a day or two, but then expectations feel unclear, or they're not really sure if they're just supposed to be doing it all on their own or what that looks like. So I think understanding that you still need to be a leader and managing the team can be really helpful. And as you develop rapport with someone, it may get to the relationship that you had with like the person in Poland, where it's like, cool, you can just kind of do whatever, like I trust you for a whole project, and that's the way that person prefers to work. But with other people, it may never get to that stage because they may not enjoy working that way. Like I would hate to be set off on a month-long project. I would be like, no, please check in with me like at least twice a week, otherwise I will get like lost.
Yeah.
um
I
yeah.
had an intern, you know, it was his first kind of, well, okay, we paid the guy, but it was like the first 3 months. And so I was like, okay, so, you know, he sat behind me and I was like, all right, so
Yeah.
we'll check in like weekly about the project. And he just looked at me and I'm like, what? Like, what? He's like, I'm going to get stuck. I'm like, okay, so like, when do you want to check in? He's like, I want to check in every day. I'm like, I will check in with you every day. Like, we'll get there. I
Yeah.
was like, okay, you know, that's what he was comfortable with. He was not comfortable setting out tasks that are a week long. He needed daily things that
Yeah.
were tactical, you know, and that's perfectly
Yeah.
fine. And that's where he's at. But thankfully, we met those expectations, right? Imagine if I was like, I'm checking in once a week, see you around. And he's like, ugh. He just like totally stuck and just frustrated the whole experience.
Yeah, there is definitely that sensing process, like watching his face be like, yeah. And I think sometimes like I'll have teammates as well who are like, yeah, that seems fine. And I'm like, you don't seem fine about that. Like,
Right.
can we, am I picking up on something that's totally off? Like, that could be true. Like, that's fine too. Um, but yeah, so just maybe to kind of recap briefly before we go into like um, kind of your own experiences and questions that you may have. When we think about micromanagement, we think about breaking it down into these kind of root things like trust, transparency, and kind of expectations or shared communication there. And so that's why we've kind of walked through these different solutions. Micromanagement, again, is like pretty natural to emerge from different situations. And so it may come because you don't know the person as well. And so focusing on trust resources at that time, or it may come from that lack of transparency or shared information. So it may be different based on different teams. You may not need to do all of these processes at once, but it can be helpful to view it through that lens of what's causing me to micromanage right now, or what's causing my teammate to micromanage, and how can I help solve that problem as well.
So right now we don't have anyone asking any questions, which is mind blowing because you are here, presumably you signed up for a reason where you're either a micromanager, you're being micromanaged. So we want to jam on your particular challenge with you. So
Yeah.
post it in the Q&A, and we'd love to pull you in, and we can work on it together. You know, the three of us, Michael, Jen, myself, and then, you know, all of the attendees, we can jam on it together. So this is your moment, you know, as Rebecca Black said. Anyone know that song?
I do.
My moment. No? All right. There. It was their
I
second
like
hit.
it. Second hit.
Yeah. Meanwhile, while we're waiting for those, any other thoughts, Jen, that you have going on?
Yeah, I think like one question we've had a lot from teams is like, is remote always possible? Like there's this kind of like innate skepticism to some extent from people who haven't done it as extensively of like an entirely remote team that works sometimes or works for
Mm.
this type of work, or I guess you could make it work subpar. I'm curious, Devin, because you've done it across lots of different types of work. Have you found at all that it is unsuitable for any types of work, or just that it changes how you approach it, or how do you think about that when kind of people raise that question for you?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I have very rarely seen it where an organization who has been in a traditional office altogether transitioned to remote work successfully.
Yeah.
I have one story that I found, and I did a podcast with them. It's from a Boston. It's actually a Boston company, Springboard Retail, I think they're called. Where they just outgrew their office, and they're like, we need to look for real estate. And they're like, do we need an office really? And they took it. They did it for over the summer. Everyone worked remotely, and it worked fantastically.
Yeah.
It worked fantastic. But it's extremely rare that that's the case.
Yeah.
I've tried to help organizations. So I spent all of last year trying to help organize. I work lots with remote companies, existing remote companies, help them thrive. But I have a vision to help more, Fortune 500 companies transition to go fully remote. And the challenge is, I think the culture shift is so great that it's really, really hard. That it's not impossible, but it's really hard to do it. We've got a question coming in from Erin. Jen, do you want to pull her in? All right, so Erin, we're gonna try to pull you in live. Can we do this? You would like to answer this question live? Yes. Wait, what? Oh no, did it not go? Oh no.
Oh, I see. I was looking at the chat. I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to Zoom webinar. It looks like we want to answer it live means we will answer it over video. So we're happy to repeat her question. So Erin shared that they moved to distributed and people have embraced it, but they miss socializing. So they have an all hands once a month, and there's a social component to that. But there are other things that they could do, and like socializing on Slack or things of that nature. And yeah, happy to share kind of some of our experiences and what we've seen with other companies. And Jevin, feel free to jump in as well. One thing we've seen is more like a weekly kind of social moment. So instead of just once a month, having something that is a recurring meeting that is purely social focused, actually. I think it's Envision does this, as well as a company called Dribble. And they do something where it's a mix of kind of like a morning coffee or afternoon happy hour, depending on what time zone you're in. And so everyone, like before the meeting, like makes their coffee, gets their like drink ready, and they might have a few topics to like start socializing off, like even simple like team building questions or things like that, just to help with that kind of awkward start problem. But they basically just have everyone call in to a meeting like this and do that together. And I think that's been helpful for them to make sure that they get that kind of key social moment. I definitely try to focus like the first part of any meeting that I have a little bit on social and being like, hey, what's up? Like, how's it going? Michael, who's on the call and is one of my teammates, he and I often do some of our one-on-ones over video, and because we have some of the trust relationship built, I think it's pretty easy for us to actually be candid and call in when we're still, like moderately in PJs, or just be like, hey, like I'm here and have that trust relationship. The other things we've seen are that donut app that Jevin mentioned, which will pair people for one-on-ones. My fiance works at LinkedIn, and I know his team uses that really successfully. And he's gotten to know people who work in Nebraska, who work in all sorts of different places. And he was like, I never would have talked with that person otherwise. And like, got to know that like, we both are really into like this one type of music that I liked when I was like 17. And so things like that, I think really help to give people that bond then to socialize in other meetings too. What have you seen, Jevin?
Yeah. I don't think I don't think you can discount in-person meetings, even if the team is remote. So, all of the bigger organizations, Zapier, Buffer, Basecamp, like all these kind of these big remotes, like very vocal remote distributed companies, they all have 1Password. Like they all get people together at least once a year for like an all hands, all team retreat, just to jam, like just to hang out and develop those relationships. You can imagine, like this guy in Poland, like he's a great friend of mine. We chat every day on Slack. But that took like 6 or 7 years for us to really get to know each other virtually. Now imagine if he was already living here, we've been good friends for weeks, months, and then he moves away. Like we've accelerated that whole relationship just because we've done things informally. Now that's kind of on the more expensive and commitment end of doing things. I have a little blog post called virtual team building stuff or remote team building. I put it in the chat. But it's got some ideas in there. This past week for my team, I organized, before like we have a weekly meeting. We just did Space Team together. If you've heard of this, it's like it's over 5 years old. It's just like a crazy chaotic thing. Everyone's on their phone. You can play through the internet, and you're like
Huh.
shaking, yelling at each other. It's great fun.
Oh, that's
Like,
a great idea. Like a shared game that you're all playing.
thanks. I love it,
A
man.
lot of like my distributed friend groups, we play games together over the internet, and it actually works pretty well for that.
Really?
Oh,
Huh.
can you also hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, sweet. Apologies. Yeah, it's been fun. The other things I think like our team does is include like socialization in some of the like more boring aspects of work. So like every PR that we do at Range that gets merged in GitHub also has a GIF associated with it. Like, how does this PR make you feel? And you have to like add a GIF to express that. And so I think that's a fun thing to do when you're not always in person, is to find ways to like institutionalize socializing on other aspects. Aaron mentioned that they also use a plugin called Taco, which I'm not familiar with, but sounds like it's also oriented.
Hey, I know all about Taco.
Oh, sweet.
Here's the sticker, right? So here you go.
Oh, nice.
Taco. Yeah. So I'm a fan. So Taco is a little tool where you can recognize your other teammates doing something cool. You've got 5 taco emojis that you can allocate per day. And then you just say, hey, super fun to jam with Jen. I'm giving her 3 tacos. And then I save another 2 for Michael or something. And then there's like a leaderboard for who gives the most tacos and receives the most tacos every week. And you can connect them to real rewards. So if you get like 200 tacos, you can like get a day off or something, depending on how the leadership sets it up. But it's a fun little thing.
That's really cool. We have one more question, it looks like, from Niraj. I have more than one company and I'm looking to optimize expectations when checking in daily. Is it possible? He says they'll be filming in remote locations for a film production company and not being in touch for 10 days because of like cell communication or things like that. So kind of any ideas there. And yeah, that's actually a really great question. One of the things we found with Range is that having a structured form for an update that you share, no matter the timeline on which you share it, can be really helpful. So even if it's the expectation is you share it every 2 weeks or when you get back from not having communication, if you have kind of 6 questions or something, or even 3 questions that people are supposed to answer, that can make it really lightweight for the person to share the update. Because the blank page problem is really hard, where you're like, what's important to share?
Right.
And so it might be like, cool, like what happened that was important that other people should know about? What do you need help with? What are you worried about? What opportunities did you learn about? Like you could create that question list based on what's important for your team to communicate about. And that can really help to kind of set those expectations. And you might set a regular cadence, but then say, cool, if you miss one, the expectation is that when you're back from whatever zone that you're in, you share it after that, something of that nature. I'm curious, Jevin, if you have ideas on this as well.
Yeah, I guess the question that I would have would be asking myself. So if I was in your same situation, I'd ask myself, like, what am I really most anxious about knowing while they're on this, 10-day safari? And trying to upfront address them to say, hey, like, I'm feeling kind of anxious that you're not going to take is it video footage they're doing? Yeah, film production. Yeah, you guys are going to take this footage, the video footage that I'd really like. It's like, all right, well, it's like, how much of this can you articulate and set up as expectations up front? So if you are in, if you're totally on the dark side of the moon for 10 days, then at least like you've set the expectations up for what the deliverable will happen. Alternatively, there are satellite phones that you can purchase that I think are still a lot more reasonable than they were years ago. But, if you really need to get those daily check-ins, but failing daily or regular check-ins, I would probably try to come up with a bit more explicit expectations up front to be sure that you'll, assuming the question is really deliverables, to be sure you're getting what you expect.
Yeah. Any other questions? We've got, maybe time for one more if anyone has any. And we'll be, oh, great. Thanks. I'm glad that was useful. We'll also be sharing, I think, the deck from this with folks afterwards. And you're more than welcome to follow up with Jevin or I about kind of questions that you may have. You can kind of see our information here. And obviously feel free to kind of check out Range as a software. And if you have a company that's looking to go more fully remote, Jevin is a great resource, as you've learned from this webinar, for that. And we'll be happy to work and engage on that. Let's see, I don't think anyone else has written in, but thank you all so much for attending. And Jevin, your expertise was really amazing. It's really awesome to hear someone who's worked across so many types of teams and for so many years in this way that other people are like, oh, maybe I could start this now. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's purely selfish. I just do not want to leave my house.
Yeah, it's totally awful, right? I've got 2 cats. I'm like, do I need to go outdoors? Like, it's fine.
Yeah, Jen, thanks a lot for the opportunity. I could talk about this stuff all day long. Jen, if you need some experience on kind of organizational theory stuff, totally recommend you check out Range as well. I really like how they approach things, especially for teams that are just kind of starting out in developing relationships. But that's all for me. Of course, I'm available. You can hit me up on Twitter or send me an email. But thanks a lot for attending, Michael, for cleaning up the slides and pulling in Jen, myself.
Wrangling.
Wrangling, that's the word. I was like, ranging? No, somehow I've got this word range in my head today. It's wrangling.
I don't know. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we'll be in touch.
Awesome.
Thanks. Bye.